Hey biology students, in this video we're continuing on pathogenic bacteria. This lecture video we will discuss the strategies that bacteria use to establish virulence and the ways in which they can accomplish direct damage to the host and the ways they can accomplish indirect damage to the host. Let's take a look. Let's take a look at some of the direct damage um, enzymes here. So this is not a complete list, and not all pathogens have these, but as we go through and talk about different diseases caused by specific bacterial pathogens, we'll highlight some of their particular enzymes that can directly damage the cells. Remember, this is part of the direct damage that pathogens can do to their host, so they can do direct damage. Lastly, I want to talk about toxins, and this is specific to bacteria, and there's two types of toxins that we consider, exotoxins and endotoxins. So we'll start by discussing the exotoxin first. So exotoxins are actually proteins, and these are proteins that are secreted by various types of bacteria, so various bacteria. Both gram-positive and gram-negative can secrete exotoxins. The exotoxins, there are many different types. So there's many different types, each with a very specific target cell and target response. So in this diagram, we're seeing the exotoxins now. They're manufactured inside because they're proteins. So they're made inside of the cytoplasm using the ribosomes of the bacteria, and then they are secreted. So they are actually released out of the cell. And so these little circles represent one type of exotoxin. And look at its target organ. Its target organ is actually this muscle. Well, it's actually the motor neurons that control muscle contraction, as one example, okay? So the example of this one here in the picture, this is actually tetanus toxin. So tetanus toxin is a type of exotoxin. It's in a class of exotoxin we would call a neurotoxin because this target cell is a motor neuron, and it actually prevents the muscle relaxation response by binding to inhibitory motor neurons. We are going to study tetanus in more detail in a future lecture, but what happens is as a result of tetanus toxin binding to the motor neurons, it affects muscle contraction and it causes a condition we call rigid paralysis, where the muscles contract so intensely that it can actually break bones. If you've ever had like a Charlie horse, where your muscles will involuntarily contract suddenly, usually in the legs or the feet, imagine that, but like 1,000 times worse, which is what tetanus is like. The good news is, for many exotoxins, there are vaccines available. So, well, we'll just say some. So some vaccines available for specific exotoxins. So there is a tetanus vaccine, and these are called toxoid. Toxoid vaccines are developed against exotoxins. So, for example, this whole concept of tetanus it's preventable. It's preventable by the DTaP vaccine. So you can get a tetanus toxoid vaccine. How about this one over here? We have the little triangle exotoxin from a different bacteria. They're trying to get across the point that there's all these different types of exotoxins with different targets. So this one, the target is the intestines. So a good example of this one might be enterotoxin, secreted by several different strains of pathogens that invade the intestinal cells. And the effect of enterotoxin is actually to cause fluid loss from intestinal cells, which is what contributes to diarrhea, having watery stools or runny stools. It can be caused by enterotoxin from bacteria, food pathogens that release their enterotoxin, and then your cells will vasodilate and release their fluid, and that's what diarrhea is. One other thing I wanted to mention before we go to endotoxin is that there's usually, with exotoxins, there's usually no fever associated with it. So it's usually a no fever response. Okay, so let's now compare exotoxins to the second type of bacterial toxin, endotoxin. So endotoxin, there's really only one type of endotoxin, and the endotoxin is actually lipid A. If you recall, lipid A is a component of lipopolysaccharide, which is the outer membrane of gram-negative bacteria. So only gram-negative bacteria produce endotoxin. That's what it is. There's not a whole bunch of different types like there are for exotoxin. There's only the one. And it's a component of the cell wall. So notice it's not internal. It's not inside of the cytoplasm. Like with the exotoxin, we see it inside of the cytoplasm because it's a protein that's manufactured inside the cell and then secreted. That's where the word exo comes from. Exo, like released or exit, so it exits the cell. Endotoxin actually comes from the word endogenous. And the word endogenous means part of. So it's part of the cell wall of the bacteria. That's what endogenous endotoxin refers to. So the only way that it gets released is actually when the cell dies. Okay, so it's released when the cell dies as a result of maybe the immune response or normal cell death or antibiotic use. All of those could lead to cell lysis, and then it would release its cell wall components. And when that happens, we get a very characteristic physiological response. So endotoxin triggers a specific physiological response that is the same. Not like exotoxin, where there's all sorts of different types of exotoxins, and they all bind to different types of organs. So a very specific physiological response. Okay, and really there's sort of three things we associate with endotoxin. One is a condition called DIC, which stands for disseminated intravascular coagulation, which is just a really fancy way of saying a blood clot forms. Okay. We'll take a look at that in more detail on the next slide real quick. Okay. Second thing that happens is shock. And shock is because endotoxin triggers vasodilation of blood vessels. And when blood vessels are vasodilating and becoming leaky, if that is an exaggerated response, remember that's a normal part of inflammation, but if it's an exaggerated response, then this leads to a drop in the blood pressure, a very severe drop in blood pressure, and then that can actually lead to death. And then the third thing that happens is ARDS, which we've talked about before because it's how people are dying from COVID-19, which is caused by a virus. So we're talking about bacteria right now. So bacterial endotoxin can do this as well. And this stands for, you recall, acute respiratory distress syndrome. Okay, now let's go to this picture of those three scenarios that play out if we have endotoxin. Oh, oops, sorry. Okay, endotoxin. Okay, so let's talk about what happens when endotoxin is phagocytosed by a phagocyte. So phagocyte engulfs the endotoxin, and what happens is the endotoxin actually interacts in a signaling sort of cascade with the nucleus of this macrophage, and that causes the macrophage to release interleukin 1, which, by the way, is going to cause a fever response. Okay, and that's actually characteristic of endotoxin as well, where exotoxin, no fever, endotoxin, we do get the fever. Okay, and then what happens, sorry, elbow. Okay, what happens is that also another type of cytokine gets released called tumor necrosis factor. So this is a type of cytokine, so a signaling molecule. So these phagocytes, they are responding to the endotoxin, and it's really this chain reaction of events that leads to these serious conditions. So tumor necrosis factor, which is also referred to as TNF, is released, and here we get the blood clot begins to form, and that's going to block the blood vessels, and then you're going to end up with tissue death. And so we see the tissue death in this person's legs, and this is also referred to as necrosis, death of the tissue, and it usually shows up as sort of a purplish rash on the extremities. And that's a result of these blood clots that are forming from the overexpression of TNF by your phagocytes. But that's all being triggered by endotoxin. The other thing that's happening is that some of these phagocytes are overexpressing other types of inflammatory molecules, like we've talked about this one before, interleukin 6. Interleukin-6, that particular inflammatory chemical, is like a fire alarm signal going off with that intensity of signal. So loud and so strong that it causes the severe inflammation in the lungs. And so we get lots and lots of pus forming in the lungs. And that leads to ARDS. And then, of course, vasodilation is going to be fluid loss. This is going to cause what we call hypotension, which is the decrease in the blood pressure. And then when that happens, there's not enough blood pumping throughout the body, and so the body goes into shock. And this leads to organ failure and then death. So very severe response to endotoxin. So the last thing I want to add to this slide that we've been discussing endotoxin is that there is no vaccine against endotoxin. So let's make that notation. So there's no vaccine available against endotoxin. Now, why is that? We discussed that there is vaccine options for certain exotoxins, such as tetanus toxin and diphtheria toxin, but why not against endotoxin? Well, notice the very overblown inflammatory response caused by endotoxin. If we vaccinate people using endotoxin as a toxoid vaccine, they will have an overblown inflammatory response that can be potentially deadly. And we never want to do a vaccine where we put something into healthy people and those healthy people develop disease symptoms that may be as severe as the actual disease. We don't want the cure to be as bad as the actual disease. And so there is no vaccine option for endotoxin. Okay, so that's it for our discussion on infectious disease for today.